talking about the sick level, and obviously there's so much to cover. We probably won't cover all of it, but you are one of the co-authors, the only man co-author. How did you come about to be a co-author on the sick level?
Oh, that's a great question, and it wasn't an easy yes. Stacy Feiner, who was a former student of mine at Hobart and William Smith Colleges, she graduated in the early 80s, called me one day out of the blue and said that she and two other authors were going to write a book. Essentially, it was going to be an anthology, right, of collected essays. And she had some questions for me because I have been teaching a course called Men and Masculinity for over 20 years. So she wanted to kind of get the men and masculinity perspective and try to understand that, and how we dealt with issues of patriarchy in the course, and sexism, homophobia, violence. And we talked, for quite a while, and I was delighted to be able to assist. And then a couple of weeks later, she called again with more questions. And then a couple of weeks later, she called and said, Rachel, Kathy, and I would like to invite you to be a co-author. And my first response was, well, I don't know. I don't think so, because this really is a women's book. And I feel uncomfortable as a man, essentially participating in this. I mean, not for any personal reasons, for intellectual reasons. I really thought it was a women's book. And she said, no, 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 that's one of the reasons we've thought about having you be a co-author, because we really don't want it to be a book only directed to women. We want it to be a book that's directed to all genders. We think that women's psychology has something to say. I know a lot of the scholarship, and I really do believe that women's psychology has a lot to say about leadership, a lot to say about better ways of being a human being. And so I reluctantly at the beginning said yes. And as I participated more and more, there's just such a great fit. And I actually learned experientially, really, I won't speak for men, but how different they were in their everyday interactions of mutuality and inclusion and of thoughtfulness and of courtesy than I was. And I don't know whether I want to chalk that up to gender differences. I suspect probably quite a bit of it is. So that's how I got to be a co-author with Stacy and Kathy and Rachel. They've been a delight, and I've learned a tremendous amount from them.
Truly, they really are. And what's interesting to me is how at the beginning your gut reaction was, no, I can't co-author this book. It's a women's book. So I want to just put a pin in that. Because actually what we'll learn is it's actually a men's book as well, maybe more so. But we'll get to that. But Jack, you went to a all boys military high school. From doing your research when you were co-authoring the sixth level, did you notice any connections with that or any key differences from your own experience of going to an all boys military school, which one can imagine was quite intense?
Yeah, as a teenage boy, it was all boy. And I don't mean just boys attended. I mean, there were very, very strict gender rules about how you enacted your masculinity. And so, it's been pretty standard, what we call pretty standard stuff, which is, in the most virtuous way, courage and braveness, but in the least desirable ways, threatening, violent, homophobic, quite regulatory in the way that you had to behave as a boy, and reveal your manhood. So I thought, as we write in chapter 2 about patriarchy, that it was really quintessentially a masculine experience. And that also meant masculine bonding. It also meant the sense of brotherhood. Part of that courage and bravery is the loyalty, which is a two-edged sword. Loyalty to masculinity means when you hear things you want to object to, you don't. You become a bystander because you don't want to risk losing face and not being loyal. So loyalty is this double-edged sword. And there were often times when I should have spoken up. I can't, again, I won't speak for others, but I should have spoken up. And I didn't because I didn't want to not look manly. In fact, we used to have we used to have a small action, which is you'd have your rifle and you'd have it on your shoulder and you'd point to it and you'd hold your crotch and you'd say, "This is my rifle, this is my gun, this is for fighting, and this is for fun." Okay. So part of homophobia, part of that kind of masculine package is also sexism. I mean, it comes in a package, and it's enforced by embarrassment, humiliation, and violence.
It's surreal hearing you share your experience. And how did that lead to developing your course, Men and Masculinity?
Um, well, we organized the course precisely about around those three subjects:
Yeah,
homophobia, sexism, and violence. And we looked at how those underpinnings, and here's the crucial thing: we looked at how those underpinnings limit men. You know, in
yeah.
1933, so 90 years ago, Margaret Mead, the great anthropologist, wrote a book called Sex and Temperament in Three Primitive Societies. And she looked at three different tribes, the Arapesh, the Mandugamor, and the Chambuli. And she found they had very different gender expressions and gender relationships just amongst the three of them. The Arapesh were peaceful people, and she characterized them more of what we think of as the female in Western society. Mandugamor, the women were aggressive and the men braided each other's hair, right? And
Mhm.
so on and so forth. But what I found fascinating, and I think this is an essential element of the sixth level and why it's also a men's book, is that she concludes with a simple, and I'll paraphrase it. She says, "What a waste. What a waste to shape gender in such a way when we have evidence that it's quite fluid and that we could expand its bandwidth. What a waste to limit one gender to certain activities, right? And who you can love and so on and so forth, right? And it's just a terrible waste of human resources," she says, "and a waste of human potential." And
Absolutely.
so that's where I think the book extends from that notion.
Agreed. And it's so ironic because in the UK, women are still paid 20% less than men. And we also have this kind of responsibility. We are most often the homemakers. That's kind of another career. So we're already kind of running two jobs, our paid career and our home career. And as women, you can sometimes feel inconvenient for flagging that or
Yes.
bringing that up. And it almost feels like men have this mindset of, yeah, yeah, I see where women are coming from, but it's kind of a bit inconvenient to action that or make that more neutral in the workplace. And I think that's what sixth level really is a good tool to minimize that kind of inconvenience that women feel about themselves and men sometimes
Hmm.
may feel about women. Would you agree in that sense? It's kind of that unheard of.
I agree 100%. And again, the scholarship is out there. When women write these books, they just don't get traction. And I
Mm,
think in part because they're written by women, right? And so, a couple of things. One, you started with the issue of women's work. Arlie Hochschild wrote a terrific book called Second Shift. And she says exactly what you said. Working women, that is, women who work outside of the family, right? They have always had those two jobs, right?
mm,
And the reality is that more and more, of course, women now, you can't have a family essentially without having two breadwinners. So
yeah.
what Hochschild says is that women go to work out in public and then they come home and do their other job, which is taking care
Mhm.
of their families, taking care of their households. And we see more men, especially younger men, in partnerships doing this. But the reality is that men feel privileged because of what we think masculinity is, the three P's. And we
Mm,
value the three P's more than we do, right, domestic work. Three P's being one, protection, right? We're the protectors of women and children. Two, we're the providers. And that really is now suspect because, again, all around the world, you have women that have worked. And in the US, more and more men are being displaced out of work, especially what I would call the conventional blue collar jobs. And women have had to go to work, right? So you've got protection, right? You've got provision, right? And you've got procreation, right? And so those three P's have been elevated to essentially a privileged status. And you're right that we tend to devalue women's work. We have not made in the United States an investment in childcare. So during COVID, it was women who had to move to part-time jobs. It was women who had to leave their jobs, right?
Also,
Much
we're
more at much higher rates than men.
yeah, and we're also socialized as women to go more towards those kind of caregiving jobs, which do tend to be lower paid, nursing or, that kind of thing, that they are just lower paid. But when we're children, we're taught to be agreeable, we're taught to help others, because that's what society has told us to be. And it's the men that are told to go for things. So it's almost like as a woman, when you do go for things, it's like you're still kind of you're still a woman. Do you know what I mean? That's sometimes how it can feel
Well,
like, oh, great.
you're
I'll move
devalued,
on.
and again,
Yeah.
right. And to get to your point, to get that point that you just started with, we also have a tax day, right? Women's tax day, and essentially it takes till April of the following year. I think it's March or April for women who are in the same jobs to earn equal pay, right?
Mm.
So when we talk about the sixth level is about revaluing women
Yeah.
and women's leadership, starting in the family, right? And elevating it to a principle that actually works better, right? Works better in organizations, right? In businesses and so on and so forth. In other words, we need to rethink women's psychology. We need to elevate it as a powerful principle. And when you say we devalue care, we're arguing the ethic of care, right, that comes out of mutuality is a
Yeah.
central component of effective leadership. We're not saying there isn't any hierarchy. Of course, when you have leadership, there's always hierarchy.
Of
But the
course.
relationship that the leader creates with the staff member, with the employee, is absolutely critical. We learn it from women and how they lead. And we need to start elevating these components of women and women's leadership rather than continuing to devalue women as mere caretakers.
Hmm.
Caretaking requires an enormous amount of both cognitive and emotional work to do it well.
And like the book, Sixth Level, it illustrates that so well through the contributors' stories as well as solid examples. Can you share some insight on the qualities in the book, such as mutuality? I always get them mixed up, so I've written them down. Mutuality, ingenuity, fairness, and intrinsic motivation. Nailed it. Um,
Sure.
can you give some examples of how these are different and better than normal ways of leadership styles?
Well, let me start backwards, which I often like to do,
Do you?
which is where are we in in our time, right? In the 2020s. And where we're in our time is this. One, young people want relationships. They don't want to be treated transactionally. So if you're talking about being an attractive employer, right? We're not talking, we diminish this notion of mutuality as being gushy, right? The reality is that when you truly care about your employees, when you seek out to have a relationship with them in which you're not merely using them, and I use that word very specifically, using them transactionally as a means to your end or a means to the organization's end, what you've got is you have people, one, that want to work for your company, two, that want to stay working for your company. The old rule, it's much more expensive to hire than to retain someone, right?
100%. I know that from
And we know
recruitment.
that young people, right, we know that young people want to be in companies they want to care about, and that they don't want to be treated merely as a cog, right, or merely as a chip that can come and go, right? So let's start with that. The second thing is that we have far more women now in leadership positions and in business. So we are seeing some progress there. And we need to adapt to that, right? Women have done pretzel work trying to act like men, and they haven't found it satisfying. And we know, and McKinsey and companies out there, and Pew is out there demonstrating through the data that when you put women on boards of directors, when you have women in leadership, and this goes for diversity more generally, you end up with a company that's a better company, and that also means sustainable and productive. Right. Yeah. So again, I like to start backwards, which is let's talk about the results. Let's talk about what the endpoints are. Right. Yeah. And those are critical things. Third, more and more women, especially in the United States, are in college, and the men are retreating. They aren't going to college as much. Why? One, they don't want to compete with the women. And there are very talented men out there. And I always tell my male students, if you are a male of talent, you will always get a good job, right? Mm-hmm. Because we have growing economies. But if you're a man who's gotten the job because you're a man, right? In other words, you've had that privilege. And again, we have data, we have studies on issues of gender, issues of race, same resumes, a name that indicates it's a woman or that it's a person of color, and the men then get the jobs with greater frequency. So to me, the data is really clear that now is the time to be a sixth-level leader, whether you're a woman or a man. Right? You're going to get hires. You're going to get people who want to continue to work for you. You're going to get intrinsic motivation, that productivity that you're looking for from them. Right? And you're going to create an organization you can be proud of that's fair, right? And just, right? So it all starts for me with mutuality. Mutuality, again, the psychological component is emotional intelligence as one of them, but the other major component is empathy. Sherry Turkle at MIT has cited studies in which there's already in college students a measurable reduction in empathy, close to 40%, right? Reduction in tested empathy. And they essentially say that the cause is likely to be cell phones, texting, the reduction of eye-to-eye, face-to-face. Kids are plugged in, they're wearing headphones. They're not listening to the same music on the radio, right? They're not listening to the same music on the CDs, right? And so, what the sixth level seeks to do is say, look, we need to move our relationships, especially our leadership, right, into empathic, right, ethic of care-based leadership that produces the right hires, the right retention, the right productivity, the right sustainability. Right. And it is a very sweet formula for success, both for women and for men.
Exactly.
The other advantage to men is that men can expand their bandwidth, for goodness sakes. Right.
Yeah. And I love
we can talk about that later.
The right employees, the right people, because I think sometimes what turns men off is the fact that patriarchy has taught them to be cutthroat and, get rid of people instantly if there's a problem. But that's not what the sixth level is telling you to, not to do. There's a difference between empathy and boundaries. You can have empathy, you can be an empathetic leader, but you can also have boundaries in place. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, we have a wonderful essay in the book by Elaine Riolfi. And it's called Accountability. And Elaine is really clear. We typically think of accountability as punishment, right, after someone's done something wrong. She argues accountability comes up front, where you make the job task clear, right? You make the accountability structures clear. And you train for success. Right. And you train and you train and lead so that you can reward your employees. And I think that you've had some very different experiences, right, with some of your employers, right, where it's been just the opposite. Right. And so this whole notion that accountability is something that you do up front, right, that nobody should be surprised when their leader, their empathetic leader who's tried, retrained, and so on comes to them and says, you don't fit. right?
Yeah.
You're gonna have to move on. It shouldn't be a surprise to anyone if you're doing it right.
Yeah. Yeah. And hearing what your employees have to say, listening to them, editing the workplace to serve them to do better work does also not make you as a leader a pushover. And I think
That's
that's
correct. That's
another
correct.
barrier that the sixth level breaks. It's having these more emotionally intelligent leadership styles in place does not make is
Hmm.
not a recipe for disaster. It's actually a recipe for success. As like you said a moment ago, happy employees means a much better workplace, means a much more enthusiastic bunch of people. We go to work to get a result, so it's applicable to any industry. Um, so
Hmm.
yeah, so
Yes.
let's move on to practicalities. For someone listening who might not have read the book, what practical steps can people take um, to have more of a sixth level leadership style in their business, or if they're an employee in their place of work? Are there any practical steps that you can suggest?
Yes. First, of course, a practical step would be they could read the book, right?
Yes.
Because the book has a section on. All right. Well, first is all of the contributors give very specific examples of things they've done for real that
Mm,
work, and then we distill those in the book, right? So it's all there, right, in the book in living color. In fact, a very colorful chart that distills all this. But sure, let's start with mutuality, right? It's let's start getting interested in our employees. And their personal lives. You're not a therapist. I've always said when I've been an employer, right? I can't be a therapist. That's not the right relationship, right? But I should be interested in who they're working for, right? At
mm.
home, right? What their ambitions are, right? What they'd like to be doing next in the organization. Or in a way that I could help them leave the organization in the future, well trained and ready to go on to something at the next level. So you can start with mutuality. It's called being interested in your employees,
Yeah.
right? It hopefully creates mutual empathy, where they admire and want to know more about the person who's leading them. And fundamentally, this is so fundamental. You need to have trust. You need to create trust. You have to be trustworthy,
Hmm.
right? You don't lie, right? You tell people the truth, however hard it may be. But
And that's
trustworthiness is a
accountability
critical
too.
part of that. Right, exactly. And accountability. It means, if you've trained people and there are consequences and people know what the processes are, the other employees are watching to see whether or not, in fact, you're living up to the principles that everyone has agreed to. Not just you, everyone has agreed to. The second is ingenuity. When I solve problems, and again, I'm talking about the audience effect of having employees. When I solve problems, ingenuity in this case, and we go back to mothers who have children of different ages, right? And each one of them have different needs, and you have to be ingenious in solving the problem for the family that meets the needs of all the participants, the spouse, right? And again, this is about parenting, not just mothering, the spouse, the children, and so on. And guess what? People age, right? Even your spouse ages and circumstances change. So it's paying attention to that. But decisions that you make need to be ingenious insofar as they meet the needs of the many in the group, right? That it's not just a solution that we've used before and it's practical for one particular problem, but that in fact it's a solution that everyone in your organization feels like, oh, that impacts me. I get it, right? I understand why, for example, we're cutting back, right? Or I get why we're moving this to here, right? And again, that's part of that inclusion, right,
Mm.
of people, at least in the communication stream. The third is justness, right? We have a lot of companies that just aren't fair, right? And it starts with, the gender side would be it starts with patriarchy and hiring through networks, right? I on the one hand, emotionally, I grew up this way, like the idea of legacy admissions in colleges. How wonderful it is that a grandfather and a father and a son and a grandson can go to the same college. but it
Yeah.
really isn't fair, right? And it displaces people of enormous talent, right? And so fairness, justness, we call it justness in the book, right? Is this idea. And one of the things we argue is women have been, and of course, racial and ethnic groups have been subject to lots of injustice. So we would hope that because we're operating out of women's psychology, that women are very keen on the notion of what fairness looks like, okay, and that things are equitable. The book does not argue that we all should be of equality of condition, because we all should, but it does say if we're in the same job, we ought to be making the same money, right? It says that, if a woman excels, she ought to be moved forward, right? And often those things haven't happened, right? So that's the issue of justness. And we have models in the book for that. And then the last one is intrinsic motivation. And intrinsic motivation is really the byproduct, we would argue, right, of the mutuality and the ingenuity and the justness. And that I want to work for this company. I tell you, hey, Gemma, you got to apply to such and such company because, God, it's a great company, right? And we have some forebearers in books of this. We have, Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, in which he talks about level 5 leaders. But mostly he talks about getting the right people on the bus. He talks about doing one thing really, really, really well,
Yeah.
right? And making sure that your company exudes that. 3M was such a company until they got transactional and very stock oriented and so on. Right. So, from my view, it starts with, am I prepared to change the way I relate to other people? And then it goes through that when I make my decisions, who does it affect? And is it a good decision for more than just a particular, like my stock price? And am I being fair and just? And do people recognize that in the organization? And then finally, do I want to come to work? Am I willing to put in that little extra time that a project might require and not think I'm being exploited? Right? Because I'm doing overtime and maybe I'm not being compensated. Well, the compensation has come from what? Those set of relationships, the fact that you're paying well and fair. And it's very likely that your employer is going to recognize that extra work that you've done, right? And that it's, things are going to come out in the wash, one would hope. So I think those are the practical kinds of things that people would find in the book, right? And the 16 contributors, virtually every contributor in the book is operating on all 4 principles of the 6th level. But what we had to do is tease out the thing that we thought was most prominent. So we divided up the 16 into some of the essays are on mutuality, other essays are on justness, so on and so forth.
It really truly does give a very clear example, though, throughout the book where it's very easy to read and relate to your own life. And that's coming from me. But no, thanks, Jack. Those were really good tips. So yeah, I think the main one is read the book and then read the show notes from this podcast where I'll beat them out. But what I find really interesting is that a lot of men are gonna hear about the 6th level. Maybe this is me anticipating, I'm not sure, but think, no, it's still a women's book. They're gonna have to change their cognitive way of thinking. And I'm not saying that they can't do it. It's not their fault. It's growing up in a patriarchal society. It's not a man's fault. But what would be your tips
Right.
for men to really kind of change that cognitive thinking? Because the 6th level is different and it is a different way of thinking. It's more emotional, a lot of which, again, through not their own fault, men do find it hard to do, especially in the workplace and especially when it comes to reputation and succeeding. What would be your piece of advice to encourage a man to read the book and change that cognitive thinking?
Well, I guess I'll say it bluntly, which is the future is going to require this kind of activity. Why? AI is pressing us, it's automating things, and the things that are going to exist that are human are going to be 6th level things,
Yep.
right? So I would appeal to men's practical nature. Look at the data. I always say to my students, look at the data. Look at our trajectory. Our trajectory is that what we're going to value, the human component, right, are components that are sixth-level components, not transactional, command and control components, right? And so I think we have to ask men to be practical. I think the other thing, and we're seeing it with younger men, I see it with my two sons, right? Again, going back to Hochschild and so on, there's this notion of three different types of marriages, right? The conventional marriage was highly male dominated, right? The woman did all of the domestic work, did all the emotional work for the family, right? The transitional marriage, the man helps the woman generously, right? Look, I'm helping you. I'm helping doing the dishes. I'm helping cook. I'm helping doing whatever, right? And I was such a husband. I mean, I'm 75 now, right? And I was a good
Don't
helper,
look it.
right? And in many ways, people might say, well, that's enough, right? But no, the third model is the transformational marriage, right? Or the transformational partnership today. And that is that it is a partnership, right? That the man sees the domestic life. After all, often the man's partner, whether it's a gay partner or a heterosexual partner, is out working in the world also. So the transformational says, I have a stake in the well-being of my household, right? And so I'm a partner. Now, when I talk about this, I talk about the difference between being a father, because in the first two models, you can be a father, and that's the three Ps, right? And in the third model, you're a parent. In other words, when something presents itself in one of your children, you don't look at your spouse, if you're a man looking at your female spouse, and say, well, isn't this your job? Or, honey, do you want me to do anything? Which is the helper model. But you go and do it because you're a parent. So again, I think when we look at the future, we're seeing more and more of this, and it's inevitable because more and more women, poor women, have always worked out of the home, right? But we're seeing more and more women, especially, take leadership positions, middle-class women, right, so on and so forth. And in the absence of an effective daycare system in the United States, and we don't have one, okay, which is public and publicly funded, right, the burden has fallen on women. Okay,
Yeah.
as I said, during COVID, we saw the evidence for that. So I think the message to men is be practical. One, your talent that you're going to need to show in the face of all this automation is going to be especially for college educated men, right?
Yeah.
These human factors. Two, that it's more successful, right? People are
Yeah.
more productive. The business
Yeah.
is more sustainable, right? People are happier
People
workers. That's
can't.
the second practical point, right?
Yeah.
And the third practical point is I can be a happier person,
Yeah.
right? Oh, yeah, I got to be a parent. But the reality is my bandwidth is expanded. My emotional life's expanded. The things that I can share with my spouse or my partner, right? So there are powerful, I mean, men are terrible about their own health, right?
Yeah.
I don't think I cried until I was 28 years old, and that was in front of my spouse, right? Because I was the rock, right? I was doing the masculine rock thing. Boy, I was really learned that in military high school,
How
right? To be the
unhealthy that,
rock.
and I'm sure you'll agree with me, like how unhealthy that statement is emotionally. The first time I cried was when I was a
It,
fully
it
fledged
is it
adult.
it
It's
it.
it's not okay. It's not okay. It's
Well,
terrifying.
what we would say is that all of this ambition, right, and all of this drive, got us vaccines, right, built the Eiffel Tower, right, and so on and so forth. But it also brought us monarchy, British monarchy around the world, and colonialization, right, and it did all these other things as well, including putting us on the brink of war and in war many times. So we can have the debate about whether it was virtuous. I think there are masculine traits
Mm,
that are virtuous. I think
absolutely.
that the notion of being a courageous person, a person who stands for justice, right? And so on and so forth, stands for fairness. Ingenuity is about cleverness. Why we should we men reject being clever, right? And being
Yeah.
ingenious. And I think the difficult piece really is the mutuality piece, because by the time we're four
Mm.
or five, we've been taught to be separate, to be autonomous, right? This is why we call it the sixth level, because Maslow concluded that self-actualization, which is, and I'll put a hyphen there so it doesn't have the negative moral or ethical, it taught us to be self-ish. That is,
Mm.
that my task was to reach my potential. My task was to reach my actualized self. And what the sixth level teaches us is, in fact, the total human being. It's not that we shouldn't be self-actualized, but that women have found their self in relationship. And Maslow, in fact, and this is, we document this in the book, Maslow, in fact, was thinking about a sixth level, which is very much in parallel to what we've written about, which is, wait a minute, the self-actualized, autonomous, and what I would say is often very lonely self, right? That there was a next step,
Mm.
right? Which was to actually be in a full relationship with other people and to be more whole in our
Yeah.
connectedness.
I love that word whole because that's what it is. And I really want to hammer the point home. This is absolutely not in any way a man-hating book. Men have been getting, it's
Not
absolutely
at
not.
all.
It's a book to help men, understand the best way to understand, women's psychology is to read about it. And, I was speaking with Stacey about this the other day. Men don't. It's why would I? Why would I need to? But that's the mindset that needs to shift
But
because it's
that's the rock. That's
yeah.
the rock. I don't need anything. I can stand on my own. I don't need help. And again, I'm expressing things that I still have trouble asking people for help.
Of course.
Right. So, my view, again, going back to Margaret Mead, is there's nothing written in stone about gender relations, and I'm sorry, gender identity and gender behavior. I mean, we
Mhm.
see the variations and why a man should be called out as being a sissy, right? Because they're not being quote unquote masculine enough is just, it's just old, right? And it just doesn't fit the 21st century from my view. It's just a
It
terrible
absolutely
waste
doesn't.
of
Because
what
can you
people's
imagine
capabilities are.
if you heard that in a workplace, a man called a sissy because he wasn't staying past, staying 10 minutes late because he had to, I don't know, pick up a kid for it. Can you imagine? People would be like, that is just
Well,
so
and of course
inappropriate.
it does
But it happens.
happen. It does happen, and mainly men are
Yeah.
challenged about masculine loyalty.
Yeah.
Not being loyal to a particular framework of being.
Yeah. Ah,
So I
see,
think that the sixth level is about liberation of men, right?
yeah.
Taking the harness off and saying the masculinity that has harnessed you, that has bound you, right? Choose the things that are virtuous about it, right? And by the way, those virtuous things are not exclusive to men, but I think they have been representational of men, right? And cast off the other things that really inhibit our human relations. So it's not just selfish, it's really about how we are connected to other people. And again, I think that when we look at the ways that men hurt themselves, suicide, I mean, the rates of suicide, drug overdoses, opiate abuse, so on and so forth. These are functions of men who feel lonely, or men who feel without a purpose, or men who feel they've let down their families. And I think the book is about finding ways to reconnect or finding ways to finally connect, men to men, men to women, right? Opening up our bandwidth about the ways that we have gender identity and gender expression. It should be irrelevant, right? We don't have to worry about our kids. They're going to be fine. Thank you very much, right? And it creates, I think, a real opportunity for men to be much more expressive and to be, in many ways, happier.
Yeah. And speaking of kids, they're going to be more than fine growing up in a kind of sixth level household as well. Nothing to do with work,
Absolutely.
just, you know, I mean, this is a bit of a side note, but a lot of women now are having to come out and justify their decision to not have a family and children.
right?
Like, doesn't that just show the kind of the fact that we have to just justify and kind of say, well, this is why I'm not making this life choice, which is totally no one's business and totally fine. Do you know what I mean? That should little examples like that should prove to men because if a man doesn't have to
Hmm.
justify why he might not want a family in his life, you know?
Right, right.
Oh,
Yes,
Jack,
and
we could go
Japanese
on.
women, younger Japanese women, many of them are choosing not to get married because the gender impact of their doing that means they can't work. They're not allowed to work outside of the home, right? And so, in many ways, they've decided their lives are going to be without children and to fill up their lives with the friendships and travels and adventures with their girlfriends.
Yeah, and
Right?
just
Because again, they're
other
finding, and again, this
interests.
is about what the 21st century is begging us. It's trying to pull us forward into ways that we just cast aside some of these, what I consider to be really archaic and often deeply, deeply dysfunctional ways of being, right? Especially as men or as women. And of course, there's this wonderful book. Again, I go back to books. I'm a scholar and I'm an academic, right?
No,
A
it's
professor.
brilliant. And
Edwin
guys, I'll link
Scher
them
wrote
all
a
down
book.
below.
Edwin Scher wrote a book called Labeling Women Deviant. Fascinating because it was a male author. But he essentially said women are caught in the classic schizophrenic double bind. When they act like a woman, from a man's point of view, they're inferior, right? As you say, feminine, emotional, right? So on and so forth. And when they act like a man, oh my goodness, there's the B word, right?
Yeah,
They've
the
got the machetes out there,
inconvenience.
castrators, right? So he says women are in the double bind. It's a lose lose for women regarding enacting gender. And the sixth level says we have to release, right? Release us to our capabilities, and we need to stop insisting that one way of leadership that generally is linked to men, which is command and control, and you got to be strong. One of our collaborators, I won't. That people can read about it. Her longstanding male boss brought her in and said, "You're going to be the next director, and I want you to remember this is a very lonely job. You have to make tough decisions, right? And people just are afraid to come in the office." Well, then in the article she reports her office is filled with people. Why? Because she's a sixth level leader. She starts with mutuality. She starts with the ethic of care, right? So right there you see that, that kind of difference on that continuum, right? Of essentially, a kind of more masculine command and control. I got to make tough decisions. I can't be friends with people, so on and so forth. William White wrote a book in 1950 called The Organization Man, in which he said two things. You'll be amused by the second one, but he said, you can't become friends with your colleagues, men colleagues, because you may end up being their boss. That was one of his conclusions. Two, women go to college so that when the husband brings the boss home for dinner, she can provide intelligent conversation. There you go. 1950s.
Yeah, I mean,
So, welcome to the 21st century.
isn't it better? I think, Jack, I mean, we've covered so much there, and I'm still struggling with a final question to ask the co-authors and contributors, and I think we've truly covered it. But if you could summarize in one sentence, maybe, why should men read the sixth level?
Well, everyone should read the sixth level because chapter 9 says we need to reconfigure, right, the way that we work, the way that we relate in our families and take care of our households, and that we have for too long diminished women. We've diminished the way that women solve problems and lead in the world, and that it's about time that we actually embrace these psychologies and together, males, females, pick your gender at this point, right? Non binary, so on, move forward to create a much more sustainable, much more productive, and a much more human workplace and family life and so on. And that's a long one sentence.
It's beautiful, beautifully done. I was thinking, how is he going to do this? But you did it. Well, thank you so much for being my guest here. Yeah, it's just
Oh,
read the
thank you
sixth
for the
level.
opportunity, Gemma. Yeah, yeah, we really appreciate it, and we are available for consultations, right? And so we're
Great.
developing trainers and training certifications, and we really think we want to make it a movement. So we have to put the infrastructure together, right, to be able to start connecting people, right, more effectively, so that this begins to move its way out into, lots of different organizations. We've had a lot of support on the book tours and on the book signings. We have a lot of traction. We're more and more doing seminars and workshops, for banks, right, for all sorts of companies. So
Yeah.
we really think that there is the possibility that there really could be a movement here. Different from a lot of other books insofar as that we really want action. So many
Yeah.
wonderful books, and to name some names, Malcolm Gladwell, brilliant tipping point. How do you operationalize the tipping point? Right? How do you know when you're there? So Sixth Level really has concerned itself, especially with the 16 collaborators, of we really wanted to integrate theory into practice. And
Mm.
now we want to bring it into practice.
And it's
So this is a
been,
great opportunity for us to kind of
yeah,
spread the word. And thank you so much, Gemma. We really
no,
appreciate it.
thank you, because I'll do another episode on how I utilize the sixth level and how it, actively got my life in motion, really. So, yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Well, I know we'll continue to